Who Gets to Decide? A liberty-based podcast that brings a little piece of sanity to a confused society drowning in a culture of craziness. And here is your host, Seth Martin.
Well, all right. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Who Gets to Decide. This is Seth Martin, your host, and this is episode 649. So we're almost to 650. Wow, it's hard to believe. Well, the war's still going on. Just to give you an update on me, I came back from my ski trip with a little bit of cold, and I'm still suffering from it. So hopefully I don't sneeze or cough during the show. I may take a few more drinks today than normal just to get through it, but I'm kind of rounded the corner. But this is going to be the cold and flu edition of Who Gets to Decide. I was watching some videos the other day, and I ran across this guy, Richard Wolff, and maybe some of you have heard of Richard Wolff. He's a professor somewhere. I've got his bio. I don't know if I have it handy, but I read through his bio, and he's a professor somewhere. He's retired now, but he, maybe it's UMass, maybe University of Boston, Massachusetts, or something like that. And he's an economist, and he has a show called Democracy in You or something like that. And it's a pretty well-produced show. You'll see here when I play it in a minute. But the content was just horrible. I mean, some of these old communists are still just lingering around, and their ideas they know how to sell their ideas. Okay. I'll give them that. They know how to make it sound right, and profit is bad because we give it to the entrepreneur or the capitalist or whatever that he says. We'll talk about that in a second. But to me, these fundamental ideas, you just cannot let these go unchallenged, because everything else flows from that. If you're trying to understand the world, or you're trying to make sense of running a company or whatever, if you have these ideas that are incorrect, then it makes it very difficult to be successful, doing what you're trying to do. And vice versa. If you're voting on certain public policy and things like this, if you don't understand the base kind of mechanisms undergirding these ideas, then you're just lost. It's like having a blindfold on and playing pin the tail on the donkey, and you're spun around and you can't make bearings. You can't get your bearing on anything. So the world is a lot easier to understand if you define your terms and stick to principles, what we call first principles in engineering, and just reason through, but don't stray from those things. Because if you stray from those things, you're gonna find yourself a little bit confused and somewhat spun around from reality. I want to focus in on this very first part, because what he's saying is he's talking about capitalism, and he's talking about the case for capitalism and how it rests heavily on these ideas of risk and profit. His thesis is something we're going to listen to it in a second, but it's something along the line that, well, the entrepreneur or the capitalist deserves their profit because they take a risk. And he goes on this long thing about, well, employees take a risk too. No, look, employees don't take a risk in terms of, you might take a risk leaving one job for another, but when you're an employee, you work for 2 weeks and then you expect to get paid. There's no risk taking there, and then after 2 weeks after that, you get paid again. And some people get paid once a week, some people twice a month. It just depends on what your arrangement with the employer is. But he's somehow saying that the employee also takes a risk, and this is just not true. This is not, in no sense is this true in the same way it is for the entrepreneur or the capitalist. And then he misdefines capitalism. What is capitalism? And so to me, you have to have good definitions of these terms, and then in order to understand them. Otherwise, it's just you trying to make sense of the world, and you just make up your own definitions. Well, rich people are greedy, and so therefore they must be bad. Therefore, their risk is really stolen from me, and all this kind of crazy nonsense is where you end up when you don't anchor yourself in reality. And it's been a long time since we've done one of these shows, so I just thought, I'm not feeling well, but this kind of talk always makes me feel better. So I thought maybe we would spend some time today revisiting some of these ideas. And this guy, Richard Wolff, look, he's pretty popular online, I think. So I think it's important, again, to take him and just take on, I mean, I'm not criticizing him personally or anything like that. I just want to take on his arguments, the case he's trying to make for why capitalism's bad and how it rests on these two pillars, which are fallacious in his mind. And I just want to address that so that we can stop the cycle of what I call stinking thinking or rotten thinking. If you have stinking thinking, well, then that doesn't produce positive things. It produces stinky results. So anyway, let's go ahead and dive into Richard Wolff here and listen to a little bit. I just got one big long clip, so I'm going to stop and start it as I feel compelled to address something he's talking about. But I want to let you get kind of warmed up with what I want to address what he is saying himself, okay? Not my interpretation of what he's saying. So without further ado, let's listen to Dr. Richard Wolff here.
To keeping capitalism going. What do I mean? I mean, these are things people believe, and because they believe them, they don't question, let alone act to do better than capitalism. They think they're stuck with it, or even worse, that it's really a good system that's reasonable and fair and therefore appropriate. It isn't. And here are two examples to show you that. The first has to do with a concept called risk. Here's the idea.
All right, real quick, before we get into risk, a lot of times, especially in political debates and stuff, you'll hear people talk about fairness. What's fair? A fair wage or these types of terms. So fairness in economics means nothing, okay? Economics essentially is the study and understanding of the best ways to allocate scarce resources. So the idea is, other than the air you breathe, almost everything else that you experience in the world is scarce. The dirt on the ground is not scarce, but the dirt on the ground, if you're going to make it into something, like if you want to make it into gold or you want to make it into steel, something that can actually be used, that takes resources. It takes knowledge. It takes capital goods. It takes investment capital. It takes land, the ownership of land and the means of production and things like that. And so is it fair, okay, that, I don't know, if I'm going to be in the mining business, I got to go out and raise $800 million in investment capital to build my mining operation? Is that fair? I could just sit there with my arms folded and go, life's just not fair. It's not fair that I have to raise $800 million to go build my mining operation. And so a lot of times when you're looking at these kinds of arguments, they're from a particular perspective, and he's going to talk from the perspective of the worker. Okay, what is the obligation of the worker in a mining operation, let's say? You might have a job description that says you're going to run some crane or some truck or something, and you have to be at work at a certain time, and you have to work so many hours per day, and maybe they have some goals for you to hit. You need to make 8 trips a day or something like that. And what's going to happen, whether you hit those goals or not, by the way, you're going to get paid at the end of the week or the end of 2 weeks, okay? Now, as a worker, you might look at that and go, well, that's just not fair. And that, of course, that presupposes fair to whom? I mean, and what are you comparing that against? I mean, mostly we work in a voluntary type workforce. People that don't want to drive trucks in a mining operation typically are not forced to drive trucks in a mining operation. So presumably, there are people drawn into that job because the pay is higher, maybe the hours are shorter. There could be a number of reasons why people do that. Well, is that fair? Is that not fair? I mean, who decides what's fair, right? what is really happening there is the employer, through trial and error and going to the market and hiring people and firing people and looking for the qualified people and things like that, what they do is they figure out kind of what the sweet spot is. Oh, we have to pay somebody $55 an hour to do this job. And that way we can reduce our turnover. But then in turn, we can expect a certain skill set. They have to have so many hours behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler or whatever. I mean, we could go into the weeds on this whole thing. But fairness is not really a qualification either of the worker or a requirement of the employer. Again, fairness, when you're talking about fairness, there's some sort of omniscient, being that's deciding what's fair and what's not fair. No, I mean, this is why working is voluntary. You have a worker that voluntarily comes to an employer. The employer voluntarily hires the worker. As long as everybody's happy, the worker stays employed. As long as the business is healthy, the worker stays employed. These are the types of arrangements we have in a voluntary working society. There are some employers may decide that fairness might look like, okay, when we have a new job, we're going to bid these jobs. We're going to post them. We're going to give people plenty of time to apply for them. And everybody's going to have an equal opportunity to pursue promotions within the company. Maybe that's fair. But it's not like you get to hire on and decide, I actually want a percentage of the operation because I think that's fair. That's not how things are going to go, right? Because property ownership is probably one of the most important pillars of capital. It's actually not risk, and it's not profit even. It's, do you have the right to dispose of some particular piece of property in the way that you want to dispose of it? That's what's key. And fairness has got nothing to do with it. You either own it or you don't own it. That's it. There's no, well, I sort of own it, or anything like that. I mean, if I have a farm and I'm trying to decide what to plant on the farm, is it my farm? Do I own the land? Well, then I get to decide what to plant. Nobody should be able to come in there and tell me to plant squash if I want to plant okra, for example. And so property ownership is what dictates. Now, you may not like this. Okay, let me address this for a second. You may not like that. Well, Seth, that's part of the problem is, the ownership of things is in the very small hands of people. Well, okay, what's your proposal? I mean, are you proposing to expropriate and steal that property from the people that own it and give it to cronies or connected people? I mean, what is the solution there? Because the problem is if you start attacking property rights, all this other stuff goes away. All the prosperity that we have from something like capitalism, if you like that, okay, it all starts to go away once you impugn property rights. So again, it makes no sense. It's goofy to just jump right into the middle of this stuff and start talking about risk and profit when you don't even have kind of a foundation of what it is in the first place. And let me address that. What is capitalism? We've talked about that on the show before, but capitalism is simply you mixing your labor and your knowledge with some capital good to increase your overall productivity. That's all it is. So in a very simple term, you going to work for an employer and them giving you a computer to work off of and an email account and a co-pilot license and stuff like that, all that stuff makes you productive in your job. And if you don't believe me, go out and start your own company and figure out what it takes to produce all that from nothing. You don't realize, a lot of us don't realize how valuable the name is in the company that you work for. Just the name alone drives business to the company, which you as an employee benefit from. And so, is that fair? So, again, I'm going to start my own business, and because nobody's ever heard of me, I'm going to sit back and claim that's not fair. These are dumb ideas. Okay, these have no bearing on whether capitalism works, whether it doesn't work, whether it's better than communism or socialism or some other ism. These are like little pity parties that people throw, and Personally, I'm kind of embarrassed for this guy because he's been around the block for a while, obviously, looking at him. And he's a professor. He should know better. He's well read. He's got his own ideas. He should know better. And anyway, I just thought we would define a few terms. Capitalism is just, the other example I give, and I like this one, is let's say you're working in a warehouse. I've given this one before, and your job is to move 400 boxes a day from one end of the warehouse to the other. Okay, and maybe for that job you get $5 an hour. Okay, and your employer one day, he comes back from this convention. Who knows what he was doing? Maybe he played some golf while he was there. Well, that's not fair, or whatever. But he comes back from this convention and he says, look, he tells you, hey, I went to this convention and one of the things they showed me was this new thing called a forklift. And what I want to do is I'm going to buy one of these forklifts. I'm going to teach you how to drive it. And instead of paying you $5 an hour, I'm going to pay you $25 an hour. Okay? But instead of bringing 400 boxes per day from this end of the warehouse to the other, I want you to bring 4,000 boxes. And you'll see how all the details work out. It'll be fine. You're really going to like this. By the way, you got a 5-fold increase in your productivity. Your standard of living just went up 5-fold. And fundamentally, your job didn't change. You're still moving boxes from one end of the warehouse to the other. So this is capitalism. This is taking capital, a machine, a capital good, and mixing it with your labor in order to get some higher level of productivity. And this is how our standard of living increases over time, and we produce more and more. Okay? This is how it works. All right, let's jump back into Professor Wolff because I've got a cough and I'm going to drink a drink of my drink here.
And it is pushed in countless textbooks, in countless speeches given by CEOs on the 4th of July, and so on. And the idea is this. Capitalists, the rich people who own and operate the factories, the offices, and the stores that comprise our economy, these capitalists are doing us a huge favor. They are risking their money. After all, it's theirs. They could hold it back. They could not invest it. And by invest, I mean go into business, hire workers, buy machines, produce a product, a good or a service, and to sell it. We're all supposed to be grateful because we have goods and services which only exist because they risked investing their money. And we have...
Okay. God, man. People like this, this is probably a very nice man. I shouldn't attack him personally, but this is just annoying as hell to me. First of all, nobody is asserting that capitalists are doing us a favor. Most of the time we don't even think about the capitalist. We just kind of go, man, this iPhone is cool. I want to buy one. We don't sit around and go, boy, thank God for those capitalists. I'm glad they're doing us a favor. Whew. Boy, if they weren't doing us a favor, we'd all be squandering around in the dirt for worms or whatever. Nobody thinks like that. Now, you should think like that because there is an element of truth to that. But the capitalists do what they do because there's an incentive to do it and they know how to do it. Okay? That's the only reason. They don't need our appreciation to do what they do. In fact, we're going to talk about it in a minute, but if enough of us don't like what they do, we don't buy, and then their profit goes down, and that's a signal to them that, hey, what you're doing is not working for us, the consumer. But the idea that we should all be grateful to allow the capitalist to take risk so they can make profit, that's idiotic. That has nothing to do with anything. You can be grateful, not grateful, it doesn't really matter. It has nothing to do with it. It has to do with incentives. if a capitalist is going to do something, anything, well, then there has to be some incentive to do it. Otherwise, you do nothing. And even with that incentive, it's not like it's an easy thing to do, right? You still have to, maybe have a very good idea. You need to have excellent execution. You need to maybe have a little luck. You need to have some seed money. You need to not have a huge cash flow outward of your life. There's a whole bunch of things you need to do to improve your chances of success. And none of it has anything to do with whether or not the people buying what you're making or servicing or whatever are grateful. That's just dumb. And I'm sorry, if you're a professor and you claim to be a professor of this subject, that's a dumb way to teach it. Like our livelihood, our standard of living depends on us being grateful for the capitalist, and so grateful, in fact, that we're allowing them to have profit because they took a risk. I mean, this is just, I don't know how to say it any other way. It's just stupid. Anyway, let's continue with Professor Wolff, because I could tell by the way he's talking, he really believes what he's saying, for sure. But he's just a relic, a little communist relic from the past.
Jobs, which exist because they risked investing their money. So for the products we enjoy and depend on, for the jobs we depend on, we appreciate the risk that investors took to create the enterprises that give us the jobs and the products. But they all go further, don't they? These capitalists and the people who justify for them. They explain that the profits accruing to the capitalists who invest is a reasonable reward for their taking the risk. In other words, we show our appreciation for the jobs and products we get because they risk making investments. We show our appreciation by giving them a nice cut of the revenue that comes in when workers use raw materials and tools to produce products. In other words,
Okay, it's too much here. It's just too rich. How many of us buy something, and as we're sitting there buying it, we're checking out at Walmart or whatever, you think to yourself, I'm going to buy this iPhone, okay? But I appreciate Apple so much that I need to, there's like another button on the register that allows me to tip Apple. I get to tip them. No. That doesn't happen, right? No, because whatever their margin is, whatever they hope to make is built into the product. When they make a product, yeah, they add up all the costs and they look at what their margins are and stuff. But one of the things they do is they say, what kind of value does this bring to people's life? Is this an $800 value? Is this a $1,200 value? Is this a $200 value? Okay. And then if it's a $200 value, if that's what, this is so much more complicated than this guy Richard Wolff is talking about. But let's say it's a $200 value. Well, now they have to build a phone for less than $200 and still make a profit. Okay. Now, if it's an $800 value, maybe they can buy higher quality components. They can build a better phone and make the same amount of margin at a higher price point because it provides that much more value. But look, one of the most important things to understand about economics, and this is, there's two things, and this was all what they call in the marginal revolution, is one, value is subjective. So what I value and I go spend money on may be very different than what you value and what you're willing to spend money on. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two is that this is not it's not ordinal in nature, or is that right? No, it's not. cardinal, it's ordinal. So for example, if I gave you 5 things, let's say I had the same 5 things out on a table, okay? And person number 1 comes up and they pick thing number 1, okay? And then I bring person number 2 up and they pick thing number 5. All 5 things are up there every time. What you'll find is that people are valuing these individual things differently, okay? And it's ordinal, not cardinal. In other words, it's not a ranked thing. It's not something you can rank. It's all based on the way they perceive the value to them at the moment. That's one thing to understand. The second thing to understand is that decisions are made on the margin, right? So what I do with the last dollar in my wallet is very different than if I have $200 in my wallet. This explains the diamond water paradox. Like if you're in the desert and you're dying of thirst, and I come up to you and I show you a bottle of water, I show you a diamond, a 10-carat diamond, and a bottle of water, okay? But you just know from the way you feel, you're about 10 minutes away from death. Guess what you're not picking? The diamond. You're going to pick the bottle of water, okay? That's because at that moment, under those circumstances, you value the water more than you value a 10-carat diamond. Okay. Now you change those circumstances and those values shift around. They change. This is why it doesn't make sense to have all these models and study things and everything, because things are constantly changing in the market. I'm getting off track here a little bit, but this idea that he's talking about that we somehow give the capitalist, no, we're not. That's not what's happening. We're not transacting at $200 and saying, I think the capitalist should make about $15 on this transaction. So I'm gonna go through this checkout line, and instead of paying $200, I'm gonna pay $215. Earmark that for the capitalist. No, that's not how that works. That's ridiculous. Everybody that buys anything at any time, anywhere, knows that that's not how that works. But this guy, he's positioning all this as if this is reality to try to make his arguments hold water. But his arguments are fallacious and they're easy to overturn. For one, they're based on definitions that are incorrect. That's part of the problem. But anyway, let's continue here.
Profit is the reward to those who take risks. Now, I want to show you what's wrong with this argument. And I'm only laughing because
Okay, before he shows us what's wrong with that argument, that's incorrect. Okay? Profits are not there for the capitalist to take risks. Profits are there to, one, to reinvest in the business, okay? Look, as much as it's different for different businesses, okay? But as high as maybe 20% of all revenue collected in a business is reinvested in the business, okay? So that means that let's say your profit margin in your business is 30%. That means I'm reinvesting 2/3 of my profit, okay? So profits aren't just like a pile of money sitting over there for the capitalist. A whole huge chunk of these profits go right back into the business. If you don't believe me, go do your own research. Again, it's different for different businesses. In retail, it's lower than it is for, a manufacturing business and so software business, things like that. But that's number one. Profits are used to reinvest and to develop and to improve operations and things like that. Because none of this is guaranteed. You could have the business today and lose it tomorrow. Okay. The second purpose of profits is to tell the entrepreneur, or the capitalist, as he's calling them, that what you're producing is in demand. People, you're producing enough profit to sustain your business and reinvest in it. If you weren't making enough profit, that would tell you as a capitalist, hey, I'm not making the right thing, or I don't have the right features, or we don't have the right service structure around our product or service, we need to change our business or we're going to go out of business. Okay. That's the purpose of profits. It's a signal. This is one of the reasons governments don't work like businesses. There is no signal in a government. I mean, you could say, well, the people are the signal. If they don't like something, they go vote. But I mean, look at what we got right now. We got a whole bunch of things going on in government that none of us like, but voting doesn't seem to do anything. So government and businesses, this is one of the things that makes businesses so efficient. If you didn't have profits, if you said, okay, we're going to run this business and we're just not going to have any profits, all the money we bring in, we're just going to redistribute to all the employees, less our costs. We're going to take our revenue minus our costs. Everything goes to the employees. First of all, the business would go out of business pretty quickly because there's no reinvestment in the business. But then secondly, you might not even be making the right thing and revenue is just going down and down and down and down, and nobody knows why, and nobody has any incentive to figure out why, because we're just splitting the profits between all the employees, and people are going home at, hey, I've worked my 8-hour shift, I'm going home. I mean, this is part of it, not everybody wants to be a capitalist. Not everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. Some people just want to have a family and raise kids, and they don't want to think about work, after their 8-hour shift or whatever. There's all different kinds of things that people want out of life. And, to the extent where you should be grateful for the capitalists, I guess we should be grateful that there's some that are willing to not just risk their money, but their entire life. I mean, how many movies have you seen where some guy's just burning the candle at both ends and his family's destroyed? And this whole idea that this is just automatic and we're just giving these people profits for taking risk. No, this is a very delicate balance of things happening at play. And there's just no appreciation from this gentleman about how complicated all this is. And then he just redefines all these terms, risk and profit and capitalism itself. He's redefined, all to make it sound like he knows what he's talking about or something. So anyway, just really interesting to listen to this guy talk. All right, let's let him tell us. He's going to tell us why now he believes all this stuff.
Me can never understand why people fell for this in the first place. And it's an old idea. This is nothing new.
The reason people fall for it, let me just spoil the surprise, is because it works. Capitalism, I mean, okay, for the record, let me just say maybe capitalism isn't perfect. Okay, I think it's pretty damn close to perfect, and part of the problem is capitalism as we know it is not really capitalism. It's kind of cronyism, mercantilism, okay? It's not free market capitalism, okay? But the reason we all fell for it, okay, is because it works, okay? It aligns incentives in such a way that those that are willing to take financial risk, career risk, whatever risk you want to, you could add up all the risks or whatever. They're willing to take those risks. They're willing to put their ideas out there, make a bet on how those ideas will play in the market, develop the operations, the raw material inputs, the labor inputs, all that stuff, all the engineering, all the marketing, everything goes into it. They're willing to do all that because, I don't know, they're gamblers, really. It's a very risky situation. But if you want to be grateful that there are people that are willing to do that, okay? Now, the truth is, I used to think all the good ideas were gone. Like the guy that started John Deere, that was maybe, I don't want to say it was easy, but you're working on a farm and you're towing your plow around with horses and you're thinking, God, man, if I could make like a tractor and pull this thing around, that would be so much better. And so he's a mechanical guy, he builds a tractor. That's a big idea and it had a huge impact on the world, right? But it's like all the good ideas, all the low-hanging fruit is gone, right? That's why you just see so much coming from the tech sector, because software and computers and computer technology and things like that. Those are the only things that are really still rapidly changing. Most everything's kind of flatlined, or, we're kind of in this milking it phase, right? We've figured out where the milk comes from, but we're just milking it. We're not adding new cows or whatever. I don't know. That's not a great analogy. Anyway, let's continue with Dr. Wolff here, because I'm not even halfway through and I've been talking for a while already.
First, you ought to ask yourself the question, all of this argument depends on something, doesn't it? It depends on whether the capitalist who has money has the right to withhold it. Go think with me for a minute. If the capitalist is risking his money, if the capitalist doesn't have to, if the capitalist could hold it back, well, then we wouldn't have a job and we wouldn't have the products and we'd suffer. And so we say thank you and give them profits as a reward. But suppose they didn't have that right. Suppose they didn't have the right to withhold what the whole community needs. Remember, capitalists are small in number. 3-4% of our population. That's it. So we're saying, in effect, without admitting it, that with this risk story, the 3 or 4% who have so much wealth can decide to withhold it from us, denying us jobs, income, and the products we literally depend on. A small minority is in that position with a great majority. There ought to bother you something about that.
Okay. First of all, it doesn't happen. Again, if you have an ongoing business, you're plowing as much as 2/3 of the profit back into the business. Always. If you just think about like in a chemical plant, you have pumps, okay? And pumps have motors on them and there's sensors and things like that. Well, pumps, they run 24/7. So eventually the motors go out or the pump breaks. So these companies that run these big businesses, they have budgets to keep all this stuff replaced. Like when it breaks, they need to replace it. That's what I mean by taking your profit and putting it back into the business. You can't withhold that money. Just doesn't happen. What he's talking about just doesn't happen. He's pretending like in his mind, a business is this thing that I got $1 billion business. It throws off, let's say, $150 million at the end of the year. And all that money just flows up to the guy on the top and he just holds it. That's ridiculous. Anybody that knows anything about a business knows that that's not how a business works. That's just not how it works. In fact, they put most of it back in the business. That's why your dividends are so small. Like, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but like if you have a dividend payment on a stock, you start looking at, you're like, I own 100 stocks of Exxon and you get a dividend payment. And let's say it's 2%. 2% of, I don't know, what would it say, 2,000, let's say you have $20,000 in Exxon stock. That's like, it's nothing really. And so that's what they return back to the investors and stuff. Most of the money is just plowed back into the business. So this idea that, somehow all this money, the profit flows up through the company to the capitalist, and the capitalist is he's got his money bags and he's just fat and he's got a big dollar sign on his chest and he's just holding this money. That's just not how it works. I mean, so this guy is just misinformed for one thing. And as far as whether or not they have the right, of course, if you have a business and you're the principal owner of the business, and after your costs, there's money left over, of course you have the right to do whatever you want with that money. I mean, who else would have the right to do it? Again, this is the workers of the world unite kind of crap. Oh, we should be able to march into that CEO's office and tell him he needs to distribute that money across all of the workers. Why? Why would you do that? I mean, you just completely undermine the value of property rights. And without property rights, none of this stuff works anyway. You get the Soviet Union. I mean, this guy, I don't know where he's coming from exactly, but I don't think he understands business, for one thing. But then the other thing is he's changed the definition of so many terms that none of what he's saying makes any sense. So anyway, let's continue. Again, this is so important that I felt like, and I'm probably not even the best guy to take this down. I'm no expert in any of this, but I've read some of the right books and I do understand these concepts, and he is just slaughtering these terms. I mean, if you were to do a debate one-on-one with this guy, you would have to define your terms. You would have to pin him down. Okay, Dr. Wolff, what is profit? Okay. Profit is the amount of money that flows to the capitalist because he took a risk. Okay, in a very simple way, maybe. What's risk? Well, risk is, I can't even remember what he said, but these terms, the way he's defining them, don't mean anything in this larger discussion. It's just a way to manipulate language so that he can make whatever point he's trying to make here.
That's not democracy, is it? Think. Suppose the money that they have, they stole. Ooh. Now the money they stole can be withheld by them, and they get a reward only if they invest it. But wait a minute, we're giving the reward for people who've invested money they stole or money they inherited. By rewarding the risk-taking, we make sure not to ask where the money came from, but there's a greater issue of risk that I want to bring to your attention. And that is that the risk taken when we have an enterprise that produces something, a good or a service, is not just the risk of the person who invests the money. This is crucial.
Okay, I know where he's going with this, and I want to stop before we get there, but oh boy. See how you have to twist yourself into knots to make all this make sense from inside his head? This whole suppose the money was stolen. I mean, I worked for an entrepreneur for years, okay? A pretty good one. 20 years, okay? I don't even see a way to steal any money. I don't see a way for him to steal any money. Like, all he had was employees that were there voluntarily working, and he had contracts with manufacturers for the right to sell their product in an area. How do you steal out of that? The only way I can think of, like, why is he even talking about, suppose the money was stolen? Okay, well, if it was stolen, then the whole damn operation is illegitimate. I'll grant you that. But are you saying that every capitalist out there, every business out there is operating off of stolen capital? I don't know, man. That seems like a tall order. Or he's saying just by the very nature of capitalism, they're the owners of the capitalism, the owners of the business, the enterprise, are operating with stolen money because that's how capitalism works? No. That's a bunch of bullshit. Okay? Now, we could create a scenario. Let's create a real life scenario. Under the Obama administration, he put some cronies in charge of a company called Solyndra. Okay? And he put $500 million of taxpayer money into it. Okay, so let's talk about that. Did you voluntarily invest in Solyndra if you're listening to this program? No, you did not, probably, just like I didn't. Okay? So I could see how you could make a case that money is stolen. That money was stolen and given to a couple of crony capitalists where 11 months later, I think it was something like that, they ran the business into the ground and they left with $500 million. Okay? So yeah, that's a scenario where if you want to call them a capitalist, I think that you have to use that term loosely. I think it's more apt to say that they were cronies. They were friends of the president, and therefore they were connected in a way that let them take stolen taxpayer money for some boondoggle. But are you trying to tell me that's how Amazon is run, or that's how Google is run, or that's how John Deere is run, or that's how Caterpillar is run, or IBM, or any NVIDIA, or Lam Research, or Micron Technology? These companies, you cannot be serious and be trying to say that all of these companies, just by the very nature of capitalism, are operating with stolen money. That's an absurd concept. Okay, it's not even worth really discussing. It's so absurd and goofy. So let's move on, because I know what he's going to talk about here. He's going to talk about the employees took a risk, and okay, let's see if we can follow this logic.
Crucial to understand. Does that person risk the money? Yes, they do. But that's no different from what the worker does who takes the job in that factory, office, or store. What are they risking? They may have moved the long distance to get the job, to take the job. They may have yanked their children out of school to move them at a time which is not good for those young people's development in order to take that job. If they have a family, they have a spouse and children, maybe elderly, who also depend on the income from the job. They all took a risk by having someone take a job. In other words, workers take risks too.
Okay, so he gave us three scenarios there where workers took a risk. Well, first of all, that has nothing to do with the business. Those risks are personal to that person. I could make up three risks that the capitalists took that don't have anything to do with the business. Okay, we're talking about risk in the enterprise. Okay, that's what we're talking about. So just to kind of make up some other risks and sprinkle them around, this doesn't have any bearing on the situation. It doesn't have anything to do with anything. I thought what he was going to say is, you took a personal risk because you quit one job and went to another. That's life, man. That's what we all have to do. We all have to kind of weigh the benefits and disbenefits of what kind of opportunities come to us, and we take them or we don't take them or whatever, But I had to pull my kids out of school so I could come work here. Well, it's not like you and I we didn't talk about that before you came to work here. You just made a decision to do that, and then you came to work here. What does that have to do with me? Nothing. So this is just, I don't know, man, just saying things like, you took a risk, and saying it a particular way or whatever, that doesn't help make an argument, okay? That's just you, I don't know, bolstering about your nonsense. But I just, man, it's unbelievable to me, okay, that this guy is a professor of economics. I feel really bad for his students. The students that came out of his class are so lost and so spinning around in circles and I hope there was no finance majors or anybody that had to deal with any kind of money, or hopefully there weren't any entrepreneurs. Probably he didn't, probably not a lot of entrepreneurs coming out of his class because he didn't have much good to say about it. But man, does this guy have some crazy ideas. All right, let's continue.
When they take a job. So does the family of the worker. So does the community of the worker. The local mom and pop restaurant depends on those workers taking the job, having the income to pick up a hamburger. If they don't have the job, if the job disappears, the risk that they took in setting up the little mom and pop restaurant will be a destruction of their lives. In other words, lots of people take risks, not just the capitalist. So if you're going to reward the capitalist with profit, then you got to reward, at least with some of the profit, the other people taking risks. If those workers didn't risk coming to work for this capitalist, he couldn't do anything. If the community didn't support it, he couldn't do anything. Wow.
Is this guy trying to say that in order for me to have a successful business, the community has to support it? I mean, what if it's an internet business and all my customers are in other states? Or, I don't know, what if it's a business that's not even in my community? It's across town. I opened up a restaurant in the adjacent county, and my personal community has, they hardly ever go over there. I mean, this is insane, really, what he's saying. That all these other people, or if I took a risk to come work for you, well, then I took a risk and I should share in the profit. But the risk you took has nothing to do with my business. If I own a business and you took some imaginary risk to come work for me, that's not the same thing as a risk that happens in the business. That's a risk that happens outside of the business, and then you come into the business. I don't know. I just don't. This is illogical, what this guy's saying. Okay, it doesn't make any sense. It's certainly not foundational for proving any kind of argumentation. It befuddles me to know that this guy, I think he hasn't taught since like 2008 or something, but all through the 80s and 90s, this guy's teaching economics. No wonder we have so many dumbasses in America. I mean, we've got too many people like this teaching economics. It's frustrating. All right, let's continue here.
Ow. But we don't pay workers for risk. We pay them for the labor they do. That's their wage. But they ought to get a cut of the reward to risk if we're going to work like that. Capitalism doesn't do that. It pretends and hopes you don't catch them in imagining that the risk is just taken by the capitalist. That is BS. It is.
All right, let's talk about a real risk. Suppose I start a business and I start the business in, let's say, 2020, okay? And in 2021, there's no profit. In 2022, there's no profit. In 2023, there's no profit. And let's suppose over this 3-year period, I also have about $300 million in debt. Is this guy really telling me that if I go to my workers and say, look, I got $300 million in debt, I haven't made any profit over the last 3 years, I need you guys all to kick in, okay? Because you've taken a risk here too, and you need to share in the total company risk. Is this guy really seriously telling me that's legitimate? Okay? I don't think so. I don't think so. Routinely, business owners go without making profit. Okay? Maybe it's by choice because they're trying to put money back into the business to grow it. This is what Jeff Bezos did for 10 years at least. Amazon didn't make a profit. Go look it up. Amazon didn't even make a profit for the first 10 or 15 years. Why? Because Jeff Bezos was plowing money back into the company. Technology. He was creating Amazon Web Services. He was creating more and more technology. He was investing more and more technology in the business. And he would come on these calls, these earnings calls, and he would say, sorry, there's no profit. But here's what we're doing. Here's what we're doing. We're continuing to invest. We're continuing to invest. We're continuing to invest. Now, 15 years later, Jeff Bezos has lots of profit. Okay? The business has lots of profit. Are you telling me that if you told those employees all those years, all those 15 years, hey, look, I'm not going to be able to pay you for your labor, but if you'll stick with me, I'll give you a reward for the risk you're taking? Never happen. Never happen. People that want to be employees want to be paid after their time is in. That's why they're doing that job. Okay? That's what a job is. do this task for this period of time and get paid X amount. And normally, if the money runs out, the employee just leaves. They got no skin in the game. They just leave and go to the next job. They don't go, oh gosh, I need to settle up with my former employer because I was sharing in the risk. I owe my former employer $100,000 because they went bankrupt while I was an employee there, and I need to pony up my share of the risk. No, that's absurd. Nobody would say that. Notice he's not talking about that. He's only talking as if it's a successful company and they already have profit and everything's peachy. Well, yeah, who the hell wouldn't want to take a cut of that? I mean, now that Amazon's doing great, I would love to just take a cut. I would love to go to Amazon and say, now that you guys are doing good, you don't need to pay me. Just give me a share of the profit. They would laugh me right out of there. It's easy to show up after the thing is done and it's making lots of money to say, hey, I want to join in on the risk. Come on. This is silly. And anybody that believes this is not a serious person. All right, let's continue.
It's true that the capitalist takes all the profit, but the nonsense about risk is intended to have you not ask the question, why should that be the way it is? Now, of course, there's other ways of thinking, aren't there? And I'm going to end with that one of them, because it's so important. Here's an alternative way to understand what happens. The capitalist, the guy with the money, confronts a mass of people who don't have enough money to live, whose only way of surviving really is by going to work. They have to work for someone. They don't have a lot of money. The capitalist has a lot of money. Might have stolen it, might have inherited it. Who knows how he got it? We don't ask in capitalism. When you walk into the store to buy something, all they want to know is, do you have the money? Not, how did you get it? So suppose the people who have a lot of money, 4 or 5%, confront a mass of people who don't have enough money to live. They strike a deal. The ones with the money say to the ones who don't have anything, come to work for me. And when you work for me, you'll produce a whole bunch of stuff. I'll buy the raw materials and the machines. I'll take care of that. And we're going to produce a whole bunch of stuff. And when we sell it, I'll have enough money to replace the tools and equipment you used up. I'll have enough money to pay you a wage, enough to get by, beer, pretzels, pizza, an apartment. And then there'll be the profit I get. And that'll make me even richer than I started out. But you'll still have to come tomorrow and work for me, because you never can accumulate enough to become a capitalist. Very, very few workers ever become capitalists. So I keep you in a perpetual condition of having to sell your ability to work to me, and I keep in my hands the growing wealth needed to hire a growing number of you. That's an alternative view. I think it's more accurate and more appropriate. But whether you do or not, the alternative argument that what we're seeing here is an appropriate payment for the risk the capitalist takes, that is an outrageous crock.
Okay, well, first of all, that's not the claim. Profit, again, is not a reasonable amount to pay the capitalist for the risk he takes. That's not what profit is. He just changed the definition. Profit is, first of all, profit in the strictest definition is just revenue minus cost. That's profit. That's the math version of what profit is. But the important thing about profit is not who gets it, okay? That's not the most important thing. The most important thing about profit is it positive or negative, and is it moving up or is it moving down? Because if it's negative, okay, if you're not making money, then that's the market telling you that you need to go do something different. Okay? If you're making plenty of money, then that's the market telling you, hey, just keep doing what you're doing. Okay. Gosh, I'm trying to remember how he just described the whole, hey, I'll just pay you just enough to keep. I want you to go back and listen to that. But the thing that I want to point out in that whole description that he gave there at the end is that it's voluntary. Okay? It's like, he makes it sound like the capitalist is standing there with a gun saying, I'm the capitalist and you're the worker, and I'm going to pay you just enough to live. Get in here and start working. I'm going to buy all these machines and everything and make your labor very productive. But get in here, waves you in with a gun or something. No, this is all voluntary. People look at their skill set. Okay. They look at their abilities. What can I, Seth Martin, do? What are my skills? Okay. And they look at the opportunities out there and they try to align their skills with the greatest opportunity for themselves personally. And it's really a marvel when you think about it. How does all this, work? How does all this line up and work? Well, it's an amazing thing, right? So this guy, the way he looks at the world, you can just tell this is a worldview thing, okay? The way he looks at the world is he sees people working in a building for a wage as being oppressed. And that colors all his other arguments. Okay? He's really not looking at the way things are as they are. Like okay, he describes this whole process, right? Well, what would be his alternative? It sounds like, to me, the only alternative to voluntary action is involuntary action. So you got, compulsion or force. You could have somebody forcing people to do things. Well, what is that? That's slavery, essentially. So he's basically making a case that slavery would be better than having property rights with some ownership of the means of production, and then letting people voluntarily decide, if I'm a worker at a company and I want to go into competition with my boss, I'm free to do that. I walk out the door, I start a new company. Happens all the time, by the way. And my boss can do nothing about it. Okay? And effectively, my boss taught me everything I know. So I hire somebody, I teach them everything I know, they become my competitor, there's nothing I can do about it, and I've oppressed that person? It's absurd, really. This is just these are stupid ideas, and I wish people would give up on trying to sell them to us, because it's exhausting listening to different ways of people trying to make the same stupid case over and over again. The only way you can do what he's talking about doing is with a whole lot of force. Okay? That's the only way you can do it. And you would have to take away private property. And we know those are both bad things. Neither one of those lead to good outcomes. So it's just what he's describing is goofy. It's not workable. His definitions are all wrong. It's obscene to me that this guy was a professor of economics. And hopefully you're not a big fan of Richard Wolff. I definitely would go listen to his whole program and see if you think my arguments are good or not. But I don't know. I think I made a pretty good case for what he's talking about as nonsensical. And I just wish, and the problem, let me say something here real quick about this, because one of the reasons it's important for me to take down these ideas is things are getting tough on Americans, okay? Prices are going up, incomes are flat, job opportunities are becoming more limited, and people are going to be looking for solutions, okay? And it's very important that we as a society don't drift back toward Richard Wolff's ideas. We already know those ideas don't work. Okay, we already know that. If the state takes over the means of production and controls markets, then there's no pricing. If there's no pricing, there's no way to know what people should be producing and what they shouldn't be producing. Okay, this is one of the reasons communism collapsed. A lot of people think communism collapsed because we just outspent the Russians, and that's sort of related, but that's more of a symptom, okay? The more causal part of it was they didn't know what to produce. They had all these people, but without prices, without a way to know what's more important to produce, you just produce what the government tells you to produce. And the government might be telling you the right things. It might be telling you the wrong things. You don't really know. And so ultimately what happens is you have huge misallocation of resources and the economy just doesn't work. But see, because we have a free market and a price system, and it's way too complicated to explain. It's magic somehow. All this buying and selling, these millions of transactions that are happening every day, somehow tells people what they should be producing and what they shouldn't be producing. And putting Richard Wolff in control of that, or some other genius, okay? And it doesn't matter. You can be the smartest person in the world. You still wouldn't know what to produce, okay? Leonard Read has this famous essay called I, Pencil. And it's written from the perspective of the pencil. He's like, nobody knows how to make me. No one person knows exactly all the processes that go into making a pencil. And you think, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, how hard could it be, a pencil? But he goes into the wood and the forestry, the science forestry, and how do you grow trees? How do you grow trees in a sustainable way that produce more and more wood every year? How do you cut them down? How do you mill them? All this stuff. I mean, you're talking about knowledge that resides in the heads of millions of people. Okay. What about the eraser, the rubber industry, the synthesis of that rubber and all the chemical processes that go into that? What about the metal little band? It starts with mining. You got to mine a bunch of dirt out of the ground, and you got to smelt that into metal, and then you got to turn it into brass. I mean, there's millions and millions and millions of people involved in each one of these these lines of production. And then you got graphite. That's another mining operation that you have to dig something out of the ground, and you have to do something chemically to separate the dirt from the little bit of graphite that's in there, and then somehow concentrate the graphite and all this kind of stuff. It's impossible, right? And so, but the way it all works is private. It starts with private. Think of it like it's a big free market. It sits on this huge foundation, and that foundation is free markets and private property, and everything else flows from there. So when you listen to someone like Richard Wolff, you listen for, is it an attack on private property? Is it an attack on free markets? And anytime free markets, you're just talking about voluntary exchange. And that includes labor, by the way. So I can voluntarily go to company ABC and say, hey, I'd like to work here. And they can voluntarily hire me, or we could both voluntarily separate. But that's a free market. There's a free market. That means a free market in labor. Okay. Just like there's a free market in cantaloupe, or there's a free market in whatever, cars. Okay. There's free market in labor. In fact, this is one of the arguments against the minimum wage, that it interferes with the free market of labor. What if you're mentally impaired and you can only produce $6 an hour worth of value? Well, you're unemployable at a minimum wage of $7. That's just the reality. And so these intrusions into the free market are a type of force, and all they do is gum up the gears of the free market. And of course, private property is a complete disaster when you take that away. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. Maybe this is something you might be inclined to share with other people, because a lot of people don't get this. They kind of hear what they hear on TV, and most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. And I'm just kind of geeky like that. I like to think about it and read about these things, but most people don't, and I get that. And so they hear somebody like Richard Wolff, who's pretty good, and he's got a high quality show here, but his ideas are all wrong. I was going to wrap up the show, but then I forgot to show you guys these are some of his personal works, and I thought I'd just mention them because I'm kind of picking on him here a little bit, but I thought I'd mention some of the stuff that he's accomplished. And so his key economic theories says Wolff work is centered on specific interpretation of Karl Marx's Capital. That's the name of the book, focusing on the concept of surplus. He argues that the defining features of capitalism is not just private property or markets. Isn't that funny? That's what I said it is. It is that. That is exactly what it is. So he's saying it's not that. Well, he's wrong, of course. So it's not just property and capital, but the specific way surplus labor is organized. Okay. I don't know what that means. I mean, why do you have to organize labor? Why is labor something that has to be organized? I don't see the need for that. And if so, let's just assume that it does need to be organized. Who's going to organize it? And how are you going to force people to organize labor? What if they don't want to organize? You see the problem? These are all techniques of force, okay? All right, the surplus analysis. In Wolff's view, workers produce a total value during their shift that exceeds what they are paid in wages. This is surplus and legally appropriated by the employer. Okay. All this is Marx's value theory of labor packaged up in the idea of surplus. But effectively, what happens if, let's just think through this for just a second. What if I work on a shift and I make 100 things, okay? And at the end of my week, let's say I make 500 things at the end of my week, okay? And I go get my paycheck, okay? And then my boss comes back later and he says, we have a problem. So we got a problem here. Okay, what's the problem? We made 500 things and I paid you for it, but we weren't able to sell them. So I need you to give me that money back. What does Richard Wolff say about that? Okay? Because that's a real situation, by the way. That really does happen. In fact, if you do business with Walmart, I had a customer one time did business with Walmart, and Walmart would estimate how much they were going to sell. And part of the fine print in the contract is if they didn't sell everything, they got to send it back to you. That was in their contract. And I'll never forget that I showed up and this guy has just pallets and pallets of his product just sitting there. I'm like, what's all this? And he goes, well, we didn't sell everything that we distributed to Walmart, and so they sent it back. And you're like, what? So it's just it's the same scenario, but business to business as opposed to employer to employee. But this happens all the time. And so there are no guarantees is the point. The only guarantee is if you're an employee, you're going to get paid for your wage. That's a guarantee. But there are no guarantees in business. There's no guarantees that flow up to the capitalist. He could produce a bunch of stuff and everybody goes, well, I don't want it. Or how about a different scenario? Let's say I'm in an arts and everybody goes to these arts and crafts shows, right? I sometimes go with my wife or whatever. And let's say somebody's got something on a table and I'm just looking at it, and they want like $3,000 for it or something. And I start quizzing them about it, about how long it took to make it and all this stuff. And what I find out is they got like 600 hours in this thing. Okay. Let's say their time is worth $10 an hour. That's $6,000. They're selling that thing at a loss. So just because you have labor in something doesn't mean that's what you can sell it for. So if it took me 10 hours to make something at $10 an hour, maybe I can sell it for $100. Maybe I can sell it for $200. But we really don't know, right? That's part of the risk that the capitalist takes. So if I pay you $100 producing it, but I can only sell it for $80, do I get to come back to you for $20 of the money I paid you? No. Nobody would suggest that. But in arguing for that's what you would have to suggest. Okay? There's no way to argue for what Richard Wolff is arguing for and not have that be part of the equation. And nobody wants to do that. No employee wants to work like that. They want to work, they want to put their time in and get their check and go home. Okay? So there's nothing stopping companies from operating this way, by the way. If Richard Wolff wanted to start a company tomorrow and operate it like that, there's nothing stopping him from doing that. He could absolutely do it. The reason he couldn't do it, to the extent it won't work, is because nobody's interested in doing it. That's why it won't work. People want their paycheck. They'd rather take the guarantee of the paycheck than the risk on the backside. That's how most people are. It's no accident that 3 to 4% are capitalists. Just like it's no accident that 3 to 4% out of everything ends up being the upper echelon. That's just the way things shake out. All right, let's see what this last thing. State capitalism versus socialism. I just can't even believe you could still write about this shit. A distinctive part of Wolff's critique in his assessment of 20th century socialist experiments, such as the Soviet Union, he argues these were not truly socialist, but were instead forms of state capitalism. In these systems, the state replaced the private employer, but underlying structure remained the same. A small group of people at the top, government officials. Okay, yeah. I mean, I don't disagree with that, but again, I don't think you can create a purely socialist state, because there's always going to be somebody that goes, yeah, I don't want to do that. And then if there's going to be somebody that doesn't want to participate like that, let's say that in my community, we have a meeting, we divvy up all the jobs that need to be done in my community, okay? And they assign me the job of collecting the trash. And I go, I think I need a higher level job. That job I don't want to do that job. Well, ultimately, when you have a situation like that, somebody with a gun is going to show up and point it at you and say, no, that's your job, okay? So even if you have a socialist environment, there's going to be somebody that doesn't want to play along. And when that somebody that doesn't want to play along emerges, there's going to be somebody else that points a gun at them to make them play along. That's just the way it has worked out, okay? Now, Richard Wolff could go start a company today, okay, and create a socialist company. There's absolutely nothing stopping him from doing that. So why doesn't he do it? Why doesn't somebody do it? I think because it's kind of like the little red hen, right? You know, the little red hen wanted to bake some bread, and so she goes around all the other animals. I'm going to bake some bread. Who will help me? Not I, said the donkey or whatever. Not I, nobody wanted to help. So by the same token, the capitalist, it's the same way with the capitalist. The capitalist wants to do something. And even if you the best you could hope for is maybe a small group that is willing to work as hard. Everybody in the group works as hard as everybody else. But the problem, I think, really is it's just hard to find enough people that could partner and agree to work together to create an enterprise like that. But there's nothing stopping anybody from doing that. If everybody involved was a hardcore socialist, they could absolutely do that. And it might be very successful. I don't know. I'm not suggesting it wouldn't. But what I'm suggesting is in an environment where, you have freedom to say, yeah, I don't want to do that. That always results in force. That always results in somebody with a gun showing up and saying, no, you're going to do that, or I'm going to put this bullet in your head. And that's the real problem with socialism, especially in a state-run system like the Soviet Union. So, but I don't disagree that the Soviet Union was really state-run. I would say not state capitalism so much as it. When he says state capitalism, I don't think he's talking about capitalism. He's talking about state-run means of production. He's talking about the means of production being held in the state versus the people. Who owns the property, basically? And his argument is in the Soviet Union, the people own the property. That's what they would say. But what they really meant is the state, okay? The people didn't own shit. I mean, you could own a toothbrush and a hairbrush and stuff like that, and your clothing. But you couldn't own property of any kind, like real property that you could turn into something. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you guys for coming in and listening. I hope you found that interesting. We talked for a long time today. I'm surprised I didn't cough a little bit more than I than I did, really. Like I said, I'm kind of getting over this cold, but I hope to have another show out to you here in a couple of days. The weekend's coming, and Easter, happy Easter to you. I hope you get to spend time with your family and enjoy one another and celebrate Christ and the crucifixion and his resurrection and what he did to take away the sins of the world. And just, remember what it's for, what Easter's really for, and just enjoy some time off, decompress. The weather's a little nice, so enjoy that, and come back in a few days. We'll have another episode for you on Who Gets to Decide. All right, everybody. Thanks a lot. Peace.